one body, is clearly illustrated in her talking about the dust coming into us. To go on with the chronology of the Catholic worker movement, in 1955, the year that I was born, she and a small group of Catholic workers refused to participate in the New York City air raid drills, and they were arrested. This was 10 years after this experience of the atomic bombing of Japan. In 1957, she visited Koinonia, an interracial community in Georgia, and this was very, very risky for her. She was shot at while sitting in a car in solidarity with this attempt, this effort at this community of integrating black and white people into a common communal effort. In 1961, the air raid drills, they had been occurring since 1955, and every year they were all arrested, this group of people, since then. And in 1961, the air raid drills were finally canceled. They had a protest at the New York City Hall Park, and thousands of people showed up after year of making this effort. And Dorothy's comment was simply, what is the foolishness of this? How can we protect ourselves from such a bomb? In 1962, she took a trip to Cuba, and this was very freshly after the revolution and the Bay of Pigs occurring. I think it was 1963. I'm sorry, my history is not that good. And she emphasized that Castro's mother was Catholic, and she made it a point to visit as many Catholics as she could, and she saw the intense persecution that was going on under Castro. In 1963 and to 1965, she participated in Vatican II Council. She went to Rome. She fasted, she prayed, she vigiled. She was part of that effort to bring about Vatican II. It was during this time that she also condemned the Vietnam War and again received a lot of condemnation herself for taking the stance. Her last arrest was in 1973, and this was out in California with Cesar Chavez and the migrant workers. Once again, she was involved with the condition of the workers, and this was at a time when she was 75 years old. And there is a photograph of that event where she is sitting framed between two police officers, and that photo is used to inspire a lot of protesters since 1973 fighting for social justice. She received the Laetare Medal from Notre Dame, and she was very careful about not accepting doctorate awards. She respected the effort that went into education, and she herself had not achieved any kind of a degree, so she was very careful about not accepting. And in 1972 to 1974, I'm not sure which year that was, that she received the Laetare Medal, and it was just by happenstance that she was not able to refuse that. She did want to refuse it, but the way things occurred, she ended up having to receive it. And that was the same time frame that Mary House, the Catholic worker now in New York, was purchased in 1974, and that is where she spent the last 5 years of her life and died there. In 1977, she celebrated her 80th birthday, and Pope John Paul VI sent her greetings, and that was the year that she had her first cardiac problems, a heart attack. She slowed down considerably after that. In 1979, Mother Teresa visited her at Mary House, and in 1980, on November the 29th, she died, and my mother was with her. Dorothy was able to be with her mother when she died, and Tamar was with her when she died, and my two sisters were with my mother when she died. So we've had a nice family tradition of mothers and daughters being together at that time. I'd like to cover a little bit of Catholic worker philosophy, and I have some points that Peter Maurin made. And Peter Maurin's program of action, as he called it, in the face of the crisis of the day, a crisis that has continued these last 14 years, these words were written in 1947, through a Great Depression and a war, remains the same now as it did when we first met back in 1933. And I have to say, in 2012, the crisis and the issues and the problems that we face are very much the same. The Catholic worker is very much born out of crisis. The point being that we must serve the immediate needs of the poor. And we also, along with this effort, we must continue to find beauty, and God is beauty. We must continue to find God despite all of this tragedy that we are surrounded with. And Dorothy went to the poorest neighborhoods. She did not avoid the very gritty aspects, the underbelly of our culture. So the 5 points that Peter Marn talked about. Number 1, to reach the man on the street with the social teachings of the Catholic Church. Let us not forget our social teachings. They are in writing. Number 2, to reach the people through the practice of the corporal and spiritual works of mercy at a personal sacrifice, which means voluntary poverty. That's another key word with the movement, voluntary poverty. Number 3, to build up a lay apostolate through roundtable discussions for the clarification of thought. Number 4, to found houses of hospitality for the practice of the works of mercy. And number 5, to found farming communes for the cure of unemployment, to solve the problem of the machine, for the restoration of property and the resisting of the servile state, for the building up of the family, the original community, the first unit of society. So Peter did his best to indoctrinate Dorothy, and she did her best to respond. And the movement really tried to be practical and not focus too much on the intellectual. And of course, there's always this question of class strife. And humor is also a very important part of this kind of work. And there was always this talk about the scholars and the workers. And Peter talked about bringing the scholars out into the countryside to become workers, to have that opportunity to get their hands in the soil, and then to bring the workers into town for more education and more cultural experience. But the point is to stay practical and to stay small and to stay local. And each Catholic worker house, and there are over 200 around the world today, each house really must respond to their own issues in their own place that they find themselves in. Each ministry must be relevant to the neighborhood that you find yourselves in. And the diversity and the tolerance, I mean, the funny thing about the Catholic worker movement is people joke, they're not Catholics, they're not workers. And there are many different kinds of people who come to do this. And there are people who are of Jewish faith, people of Protestant faith, people of no faith, atheists who do come, and they're tolerated. And I think that the longevity of this movement could be related to this business of tolerating diversity and differences. And the Catholic worker relies on charity. It's a very precarious existence. And there were many times over the course of the movement that Dorothy had no idea that whether it would continue or not. She was down to her last pennies, and there were bills to pay and bread to buy for the soup line. And she felt that if she prayed hard enough and if God wanted it to, that it would keep going, and it certainly has. But this business, putting yourself in a position of precarity, brings humility and humbleness that helps you to stay focused on God and to keep doing the work with faith. God's power works through vulnerability and mutuality, if we can only hang on to that thought. And you know, our own human strivings are naturally meant to just secure security for ourselves and our families. And she learned about stepping out when you don't know what's going to catch you. I want to talk a little bit about my personal memories of Dorothy. We called her Granny. I'm one of 9 grandchildren, and My older siblings certainly have a different experience of her. I was 3 years old when I had my first very clear memory of her, and she would come to visit us in Vermont as frequently as she could with her very, very busy schedule. A lot of traveling, a lot of speaking, a lot of writing. And there was always a bustle when she came into the house. She was such a great storyteller. Anytime she came or went, that was very, very significant for all of us. We would all gather around her. And as a 3-year-old, I remember sitting on her lap with my ear against her chest and just having this incredible sense of the power. I mean, it was the presence of God that I was feeling in her. And I was 25 years old when she died, so she played a very significant part in all of our lives. I have to say that most of my lifelong decisions were made under the influence of thinking, what would Granny say? What would Granny think of this? She did so much traveling, and she brought back gifts. She gave us rosaries, books, icons, scarves. She was always, people were always giving her gifts, and she was turning around and giving them away. And so I remember that about her, always giving me a good book to read. And she traveled a lot between Vermont, the Tivoli farm in New York. When I was a teenager, we would spend the summers down in Tivoli, and St. Joseph's in New York City. Both St. Joseph and Mary House are still on 1st and 3rd Avenue streets, where they were originally purchased in the 70s. I have to always speak about Tamar. Tamar was, to me, equally intriguing and powerful as Dorothy. She was very shy, very quiet, and yet she carried a sense of God and a sense of love that affected everyone around her. The love of one another was a message that she always carried with her. Tamar did lose her faith in the Catholic Church. My father left the family when I was 6 years old, and you know, she had a Catholic marriage. She had 9 children. My father had a breakdown not being able to take care of that many children, and there was a crisis there. So I have spent a good part of my adult life caught between her leaving the church and Dorothy's conversion and Tamar leaving the church. But she always retained the basic Catholic teachings. And she always conveyed the necessity of the care of the natural world. She was a gardener. She could grow anything. She had such a green thumb. And she also introduced and reinforced for us over and over again the dignity of work. I want to share a little bit with you about Dorothy's charism and her daily devotions. It's always important for us to study what she did on a daily basis. And I have a quote that I'm not sure if this is her writing or someone else's. By faith may we, through the power of the Holy Spirit, be kept in the arms of God and continue with the works of mercy as the need is so great in these times. And I think that's something that she carried with her. Well, the name Dorothy means a gift of God, and I found that to be pretty intriguing. And I see her unique gifts of the Spirit as her giving so freely to the world. My mother suffered. The Catholic worker movement started when Tamar was 7 years old. Dorothy gave so freely of herself. Tamar had to give her mother to the world at a very young age. This was clearly a divinely inspired gift. I mean, Dorothy did not necessarily want to pursue this work. She often wrote about how, oh, if I could only have my own little apartment and my own little cat and sit down and smoke a cigarette and relax. And so she really was pushed. It was certainly a divinely inspired gift that she had, a grace, a talent. She was so warm. Once she connected with a person, she stayed connected for the rest of her life, and that included my grandfather. For her, the passion of Christ takes on the suffering of the poor, the oppressed, the victims of war. She had an immediate response, a visceral, passionate response to seek social justice when she saw such oppression and suffering. And it was clearly always had to be a response through the practice of nonviolence. She was a Benedictine oblate. She loved that combination of ora et labora, holy work and prayer. Holy work and prayer within a community that serves the destitute. She was very clear about avoiding a personality cult. There is this process of canonization that has started, and I'll take questions and answers regarding that issue, but she very clearly did not want to be seen as a personality where a blind following would occur. Just to touch upon a few points of her prayer life. She attended Mass daily. She always had a spiritual director. She participated in community prayer and personal private prayer. She said Vespers every evening. She went to Saturday confession. She did the daily readings from the breviary. She very frequently recited the rosary, always carried a rosary with her, and that's what I remember the most, is saying the rosary with her as a child. She always kept a list that changed according to the needs of intercessory prayer for those in immediate needs. You know, her family, her friends, my brother. My brother was in Vietnam when I was 14 and he was 20. I clearly believe that Dorothy's prayer helped him to survive. She said the Jesus prayer in difficult moments within the community, of which there were many, and also within family life, of which there were many. Meditations on the Psalms and Scripture. Her diary entries are done in prayer form. Hours of silent adoration before the Eucharist. Very frequently she would write her articles sitting in front of the Eucharist. Supplication prior to her attempt at writing. Her daily practice of examen of conscience. You know, taking fearless moral inventory at bedtime. And this is something that she practiced with us, which didn't go over so well by the time we were teenagers. She prayed many different novenas, and the Memorare was one of her favorites. She prayed to the saints. Some of her favorites were Teresa of Avila, Therese, and St. Catherine of Siena. She very much became steeped in prayer in all of its forms, and she also tried to practice prayer. Pray as you can. Writing and working are a form of prayer. I'm sorry I'm taking more time than I thought that I would for the question and answer. I want to share a little bit with you about my conversion and then life at Mary House. I came back to the church. When I became a teenager, we stopped going to church. My mother stopped bringing us to church. We lived out in the countryside, and we lived in poverty, and she very rarely had a car that was reliable, and the Vermont winters were pretty harsh, so that was part of her excuse for not getting to church. So we drifted away in my teenage years. I did not come back to the church until I turned 50, 2004, and I'm not sure that I can explain fully what transpired. But the year 2004, my children were grown up. I took a temporary job in Hawaii, and worked with very young children, and Hawaii turned out for me to be a very intense, powerful spiritual place. A lot of suffering in the history of Hawaii. It's a military outpost of empire, and it's a corporate colony as well. The experience that they've had, the race experiences that they've had as well. So my landlady just started taking me to church in Hawaii, and I would just sit there and simply cry. And I also visited Mary House for the first time since Dorothy's funeral. She died in 1980, and I did not go back to Mary House until 2004. And there was something there that really jogged my spiritual being. Also in 2004, my son joined the military. He was 26 years old, and it was an extremely painful thing for me. He went to Fort Benning, where my brother had actually trained, and he was not able to breathe with the physical training. I called it divine intervention. My son was very disappointed, but in retrospect, he was very grateful. He has since become baptized, not in the Catholic Church. That experience just shook me to my core. 2004 was also the year that the pictures of Abu Ghraib came out. And as an occupational therapist, I clearly understood what was being done psychologically and neurologically to these prisoners. Also, November 8th, 2004, Dorothy's birthday, we invaded Fallujah. And there was something about this obscene scenario that completely galvanized me. I was so traumatized, I could do nothing but turn to God, understanding what was happening to the population of Fallujah. And I also made an Advent icon. My local parish, St. Mary's, that I had attended as a child and done my first communion, had a art show, and I made an icon. My husband is a carpenter, and he cut out a little triptych for me, and I put the, I decoupaged the Holy Family's flight into Egypt onto it. And all around I put these little litanies. Mothers of Fallujah, forgive us. Mothers of Vietnam, pray for us. Mothers of Bosnia. Thinking of war and thinking of the mother and child fleeing into Egypt under similar conditions. It took a lot for me to overcome my shame of re-entering the church and getting down on my knees, but I'm ever grateful. I also, before 2004, I had a chance to travel in France and Russia and Italy to all of these sacred, beautiful, holy sites. And also, recently I had a trip to Jerusalem, which Dorothy was never able to do, nor my father. So I took the trip for both of them. But there were seeds planted clearly by Dorothy herself that stayed dormant in me and then came up with tears, I suppose, tears watering these seeds. I have traveled in the Middle East, Rafah border, Egypt and Israel, where the Gaza Strip is. I've traveled to Iran, Iraq, Cairo, and most recently to Afghanistan. I have to say that I felt closer to God in a Muslim country than I did in my own country. And it's hard to explain. The call to prayer, the rising up of the call to prayer, is one clear expression of the love of God. But in the people themselves, I found more acrimony in my own people than I did in the victims of some of our policies. I would like to talk a little bit about Mary House. It's hard work. It's very hard work. We have 25 or so people living in the house. We have 50 to 70 women coming for meals. We provide the meals. We have phone access for women who are trying to make appointments for themselves. We provide showers. We have a clothing room. We have the newspaper that comes out 7 times a year. We also have Friday night meetings, an outcome of the roundtable discussion, clarification of thought, the tradition that Peter brought to us. We have students who come and do internships. They cook, they clean, they serve the women on the soup line. We have Bible study. We have Mass twice a week, rotating between the 2 houses, the Lower East Side. By the way, we're in a very affluent neighborhood at this point in time. When these houses were purchased, it was a very decimated neighborhood, and now it's quite gentrified, and we need to think about whether we should still be there. And we also carry on the 7 o'clock daily Vespers. The movement turns 80 next year, and the New York Catholic Worker is hoping to host a celebration. The longevity of the communities is quite astounding. Many of these communities are anywhere from 25 to 40 years old. And I think that, once again, that prayer life that many people do hold, but also that tolerance of those who have just lost their faith. I think all of that has played a part in these communities to still be able to thrive. There are communities in the Netherlands, in Europe, in Australian Catholic Worker, New Zealand. I try to visit as many of the houses as I can in the major cities around the country, and they're all very different and they're all very wonderful. My favorite part usually is the kitchen. But we work with that premise of nonviolence, voluntary poverty, hospitality, all on a foundation of prayer. I have to read a postscript. in the long loneliness, where Dorothy writes about how it all started. We were just sitting there talking when Peter Morin came in. We were just sitting there talking when lines of people began to form saying, "We need bread." We could not say, "Go be thou filled." If there were 6 small loaves and a few fishes, we had to divide them. There was always bread. We were just sitting there talking, and people moved in on us. Let those who can take it, take it. Some moved out, and that made room for more, and somehow the walls expanded. We were just sitting there talking, and someone said, "Let's all live on a farm." It was as casual as all that, I often think. It just came about, it just happened. I found myself, a barren woman, the joyful mother of children. It is not easy always to be joyful, to keep in mind the duty of delight. The most significant thing about the Catholic worker is poverty, some say. The most significant thing is community, others say. We are not alone anymore. But the final word is love. At times it has been, in the words of Father Zosima, a harsh and dreadful thing, and our very faith in love has been tried through fire. We cannot love God unless we love each other. And to love, we must know each other. We know Him in the breaking of bread, and we know each other in the breaking of bread. And we are not alone in anything anymore. Heaven is a banquet, and life is a banquet too, even with a crust where there is companionship. And I'll end with this very short prayer and then take questions and answers. Holy Mary, Mother of God, help the helpless, strengthen the fearful, comfort the sorrowful, bring justice to the poor and peace to all nations. Thank you.